Welcome everybody to another episode of Freethinkers Anonymous. This is your host Mike, along with my co-host Jeremy, and we finally made it in the finish line. This is the final segment of our State of the VFX coverage. All right, Jeremy, take it away.
Now that transitions into the final subject, which is a positive thing for the VFX industry because things in general have not been looking very positive. Unionization for the VFX industry. Artists in the VFX industry have been talking about unionizing for a very long time. They have been wanting a union, I would say, for the past 15 years minimum. I would say over half of VFX artists have been wanting a VFX union for the past 15 years or so. Now, that said, it's really hard to do, particularly in the US, because in other countries, you can create a union for an industry. In the US, you cannot legally create a union for an industry. You can't create a guild that says, hey, if y'all don't sign up to our guild and are members to our guild, you're not allowed to do that kind of work because we have a free market economy. So there is no way to say all VFX workers have to sign up for this union. There's no way to say that even most VFX workers have to sign up for this union. The only way to create a union first is to get the big production companies or the big VFX studios to sign on to it. And the workers at those VFX studios have to be the ones to sign on to it. If you're not working for a big studio, you might as well not have a hand in the game because your opinion is irrelevant. It's only if you're working at a big studio that your stance on unionization matters. Also, even though it's illegal for companies to fire people or pay them less or refuse to promote them or whatever, if they stand for a union, doesn't change that it still happens. And the onus is generally on those artists to be able to prove it. And they would have to sue the company that they're working for. So let's take a look at Disney, for instance. You think if you try to set up a union at Disney and Disney fires you, and now you can't set up a union at Disney because you don't work for Disney anymore. You think you're going to be able to sue Disney? You think that's going to go well? Highly unlikely. They have teams and teams and teams of lawyers, and if their workers unionize, that's going to increase their costs. So they are not going to stand for somebody increasing their costs when they can just run you into the ground and blacklist you in the entire industry. And again, Disney is one of the big five. They are one of the five production companies that control the entire production industry. So if you get blacklisted by Disney, again, you just lost 20% of your entire industry potential jobs. And if Disney lets it known that even behind the scenes, because there have been schemes with different production companies and VFX studios that are the bigger ones, like Sony, Disney, ILM, and a few others got together, basically said, hey, we're not going to steal artists from each other. And if there's downtime in between projects, we're just not going to hire your artists. We'll hire other artists, but we're not going to hire yours so that you can have them back when you want to hire them up again, which meant that artists couldn't find work, even if they worked for these big production companies and worked on amazing things, if that one studio had slowdowns because the other big studios that could actually afford those artists refused to hire them because of an agreement, which is illegal. And these companies were sued, and there were enough people that were aware of it because of the leaked emails from Sony. That is the only reason that people ever found out about it. But once people found out about it, then they were sued and then they had to kind of pay the price for it. On top of that, they were setting wage limitations. They were like, hey, we're not going to pay these people more than this if you don't pay these people more than this. And then they would bring down that amount that they were paying people. So even when they would shift artists back and forth between companies, they would pay them less at the next company and less at the next company. And when they finally made it back to the initial company, they'd be making less than they previously made because these companies were working together to make sure that artists were making less. So this is why it's been so hard for artists to fight for a union because these are the monsters that you're fighting. These are the beasts of the industry that are willing to do whatever they need to keep their bottom line where they think it needs to be. And they're willing to destroy careers for the little guy if that's what they think needs to happen. So the one bright spot in all of this darkness is that unions are finally becoming a thing. Marvel's on-set VFX workers unionized. I'm sure that for most people listening, that sounds like a big deal. It's not. The headline said, "Oh, Marvel's VFX workers are unionizing." The thing is, Marvel doesn't actually hire VFX artists. Yes, a lot of VFX work is done on Marvel films, but that's all done, or 99% of it is done by vendors that Marvel hires. So these are the big to medium sized VFX studios that work on Marvel movies. It's not Marvel themselves. So the people that work directly for Marvel are generally like the vast majority of them were on set VFX artists. It was DITs, which is the director of technology, basically, where their primary job was just to take the footage that was recorded and transfer it to the correct computer and set up the right naming convention for VFX artists. It's also VFX supervisors. So people that were on set and saying this green screen needs to be lit a particular way to make it so that once it gets to the VFX artist, they can do their job easier. Or we need to set up this rig where the character flies around in a certain way so that there's less VFX work to do on it. There's only about 50 people altogether that worked for Marvel that were part of that union. And they signed on to it and they did set up a union, and that's great. Technically, they're in the VFX industry, but they are not post production VFX artists. They are set VFX artists, which is a very unique position to be in, and it doesn't translate over to post production vendor side VFX unions. So when I first read that, I was happy for them, but I was really discouraged that the headlines presented it as if, oh, Marvel has a union now, and that means that most of the industry is unionized. When in reality, out of the hundreds of thousands of people that are in the VFX industry, maybe a little bit less than that, but at least 200,000 people are in the VFX industry. 50 unionized, and they're making it seem like a giant deal for the rest of us when it doesn't translate over. So that discouraged me for a bit. Since then, though, there are two major studios that have unionized, and that's Disney Animation Studios, and Double Negative. Double Negative is a VFX studio. It's on the bigger to medium side that is kind of known as a bit of a meat grinder, meaning that they hire artists, they work them to death, and then when things get slow, they fire them. And by the time those artists are done, they haven't made very much money. They're completely out of energy, and they just move on to another industry, which I think is a big part of why Double Negative is one of the first VFX studios that was unionized, because they understood the value of it, because it was people that were fresh into the industry. They didn't see the way that VFX artists have been treated for a while. They just knew the way that people should be treated. And they saw that they weren't being treated like that. And that's when they were like, we need to make some changes. I know when I first started for the first studio that I worked for, immediately I started talking about unionizing. And I had never thought about being part of a union before I started working at that first studio, because in general, I thought unions were hindrances to productivity and they were hindrances to creativity. And they just made things go slower and they cost more money. You were kind of forced to pay into them, and it was just a terrible system. And then I started at the first studio and I saw how horribly the artists were treated. I saw how horribly the studio was managed. I saw how the company owners had zero respect for the artists under them. And I was like, this needs to change. This is not okay. And there's nothing I personally can do. It's only if we work together as a union of artists that we're going to be able to do anything about this. So, very glad to see Double Negative unionized. Also, very glad to see Disney Animation unionized, because that is crucial to all of the sub production companies that Disney has, particularly their animation studios. And you got DreamWorks and Pixar and Illumination and all of those. And not that they're all owned by Disney, but the more 3D animation studios that unionize, the more it's going to become commonplace. And artists are going to want to go to the studios where there's unions, because they know that we're going to get paid a livable wage at these studios. We're going to have protections. If the studio starts taking advantage of us, we can team together very easily to do something about it. Maybe not very easy, but we can team together to do something about it, as opposed to the other studios where they would just lay you off if you had a problem with the way that they were doing things. And even silent protests, just not coming to work on your 10th Sunday in a row, could result in you getting fired. And legally, There's no reason that they can't fire you for not coming to work for your 10th Sunday in a row when you have had 0 days off for those 10 weeks in a row. Now you've got union protection, which at least allows you to work together as a studio, and they can't completely fire everybody simultaneously. And the union is going to push for people to work together. It's going to make it so that if everybody's tired of working endless days, that y'all can just go home. Because what are they going to do if everybody stands up to them at once? But if 20% of the team stands up to them, the other 80% don't, they'll just fire that 20%. They can replace them. But if it's 80 to 90% of the studio that stands up to them at once, you can't replace your entire staff that quick. So unionizing is definitely valuable, particularly in the VFX industry, particularly because we're seeing the effects of AI. We're seeing the effects of the strikes. We're seeing the effects of the pandemic. We're seeing the effects of underbidding. We're seeing the effects of major production companies consolidating power at the top. We're seeing the effects of outsourcing. We're seeing all of the other things that we've talked about. We're seeing the results of major production companies simply denying that there's any CGI in these films altogether, even when there very clearly is. So I'm hoping that these unions, they're not going to be a catch-all. They're not going to make everything perfect, but I'm hoping that they do continue to grow. I'm hoping that more and more VFX studios do team together. More and more VFX artists do team together at these different studios to make it so that being in the VFX union, it's under AITSE, that they can consolidate power for the workers so that we actually have a voice and so that we can make change. Because I have called out everything I've talked about in this entire episode to so many people, and it doesn't make a difference. And teaming up together, everybody talking about it, and everybody saying, we're not going to put up with this nonsense anymore. That's what's going to make a difference.
The goal would be to work for a big studio, and I think all the big studios are going to bend the knee and probably unionize. But I think studios where it's completely just all contract workers, which is where Jeremy and I mostly have worked at of late,
Mhm.
especially doing remote stuff, it's just purely contract. We're not brought in full time. I imagine any company that operates contract, there'll be no unionizing. Because as far as I know, if it's just contract based in a lot of industries, you don't really part of a union because they assume you're your own business, you got your own employees, even though most of us are just sole proprietors, meaning that we're self-employed. We are our own business. We are one man shop. We don't have other people that we load off work to.
Yeah. Well, and I will say that's one of the things within the VFX industry is that if you're actually employed by a studio, then they get to set your hours, they get to set when you're available, they get to set the way you go about doing the things that you do. You have to follow their pipeline.
Mhm.
If you're a contracted employee, they don't have any of that control over you. They set up the expectations and they set up the pay, and you either agree to that or you don't, and that determines whether or not you're hired on for that project. And they also cannot dictate your hours, and they can't dictate the way you go about doing your job. So if you are a contracted individual, they can say, hey, this is a shot we want you to work on. It needs to be done by this date. And we have a meeting around this time we'd love to have you be a part of. But if they start saying, we have meetings at this time that you have to be there for, and we need you to put in at least 8 hours, 10 hours on this project every day, and they have to be between the hours of 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 or whatever, then you're an employee. You're not a contracted individual. So that's something that's important for any VFX artist to be aware of. If they start dictating what time you have to show up and what time you head home, you are an employee. Fight for that position. Understand that legally you are an employee. If they are dictating your hours, if they're dictating the way you have to do things, you have to work in a way that we can understand your project structure and the way you do what you do. They can say that, but they can't make you put specific nodes in a specific way. They can't have you structure your shot in a very specific way. They can suggest things. They can train you a certain way. But if you decide to not do it that way, as long as the end result of your renders is what they're looking for, that's all that matters. That's all that can matter to them if they're hiring you as a contract employee because you are your own business. That's a very important distinction to make. You are your own business. You run your business how you see fit. Your business is being hired to do a certain amount of work. If you deliver that work, meaning the finished product, the end result, the frames rendered the way that they were asked to be rendered, then everything that's involved in getting it to that point is up to you. If you're an employee, they can have you do things a specific way because you're hired to do the work for them, not to give them an end result. So just something to be aware of for unionizing, as well as there are studios that I know that claim that their artists are contracted employees, but they have very specific pipelines. They have very specific clock in and clock out times. They have very specific hour requirements. They say, hey, we need you to work 10 hours on Saturday. And if you don't, you're fired. Well, if you're a contracted employee, that is not legal. They are not allowed to fire you for not doing the certain amount of hours that you're expected to do because they're not allowed to tell you to do a certain amount of hours to begin with.
True.
Now, if you're an employee, they can absolutely do that. They can lay you off for not working the hours they tell you to work because that is the extra expense for them of unemployment, of FICA, of paying your taxes for you, all of that extra work, extra expense. That's what that grants them. It grants them the ability to tell you how to work and when to work. But if they're not paying that extra expense, taking care of things like maybe in a great world, health insurance, then they don't have the right to do that. They don't have the legal freedom to do that. So again, just something to think about for any VFX artists that might be listening to this podcast, for that matter.
I think moving forward, it's like if you want to talk about VFX, either innovations or breakthrough films, just to geek out and have fun on a more casual conversation about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that as the union stuff develops, of course, we'll touch back on it once we actually know what these guys are talking about. And of course, there's that VFX survey that's out there from the VFX Union organization that for a long time you and I kind of laughed at because we're like, what are they going to do?
Yeah.
And now things are actually moving at some capacity. Things aren't happening the way people actually think they are. But was it Double Negative? Like the first real studio that actually is getting involved.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a breakthrough. Now that's something, because that's actual VFX artists like you and me motioning to be part of a union. Any major visual effects studio that has full-time staff, yes, those should be 100%. ILM, Weta, all these major visual effects studios should have a union.
Well, I don't know that Weta will because Weta's New Zealand based and they have different laws as far as it goes to unions.
Yeah, but still, just because it's a trend, and they're working with James Cameron, and we know the stories, so there's a
Yeah.
chance that they'd be like, you know what?
Yeah, might not be a bad idea.
So the fact that he's a bit much, and they're
Yeah.
going to be stuck working till Avatar 5. It's like another decade they're going to be working on these films. Yeah, they may want to have their needs met and understood. So that may be a thing. Be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you can be tuned in when we have our next major release. We have much more to come, and appreciate you guys hanging with us and seeing what we have next. Until next time.